I guess a couple things come to mind. One, I feel like we're watching conservatism be redefined. The Barry Goldwater, conscious of a conservative days, the even the Ronald Reagan era of conservatism, and then moving it forward to, say, George W. Bush era of conservatism. I don't think we're there anymore. I think we're seeing a different sort of conservative brand and conservative definition.
Hello, I'm Derek Cash with the North Little Rock Public Library System and want to welcome you to Meet the Author. Joining us today is Dr. John C. Davis, author of From Blue to Red, The Rise of the GOP in Arkansas. Dr. Davis is the executive director of the David and Barbara Pryor Center for Arkansas Oral and Visual History and associate professor of political science at the University of Arkansas. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being on the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I love talking Arkansas politics.
Uh, uh, by way of introduction, just tell us a little bit, why did you write this book?
So, as an Arkansas native and a political scientist in the state who studies and teaches Arkansas politics, for as long as I've been studying, I mean, I remember as an undergrad taking Arkansas politics, the question was, would Arkansas continue to be this anomaly in the South? Would it continue to be this Democratic stronghold? And if so, for how long, or if it switches for, what are the circumstances? And so political scientists and historians would speculate. And we move up about a decade later, and it was apparent that a shift was underway. And I think what was unique, and really why I thought it was worthy of a book and study, was not that we went from a one-party Democratic state to one-party Republican state. That's not terribly uncommon. It was the rapidity in which this occurred. It went as far as 2008, where Republicans in the state struggled to field a candidate against U.S. Senator Mark Pryor. In 2010, Mike Beebe, the Democratic incumbent, winning all 75 counties, to where we were in really one or two election cycles, where not only did Republicans capture all constitutional offices, supermajorities in the legislature, but they were even winning at the county and local levels at this point. It was the sudden nature of the partisan switch that left me just fascinated, and felt it was important to draw some attention to that.
Okay, all right. That sort of is a good introduction as to what the book is about, so I won't ask you that question. But something that you bring up in your book about Governor Huckabee, why was he so popular?
I think Governor Huckabee's really fascinating for many reasons. One, he's sort of an accidental governor. He wins the lieutenant governor's race. It's a special election in 1993. This is the year, of course, where Governor Clinton is going to be president of the United States. So the lieutenant governor, Jim Guy Tucker, ascends to the governor's office. And Mike Huckabee had just run a hard-fought but losing battle against Dale Bumpers, a real popular Democratic U.S. Senator incumbent in Arkansas. So the story goes that Huckabee is in the hospital with exhaustion and pneumonia. And the state party chair at the time is Asa Hutchinson, goes to his bedside and says, "Mike, you ran a really tough race against a very popular incumbent, and we need you to do it again in a couple weeks to run for lieutenant governor." And so he already had built up a statewide name and statewide brand in his unsuccessful Senate bid. He was able to switch gears a bit and compete and win in the 93 special election that had traditionally, had low turnout. Special elections, they're sort of a hangover after the 92 election cycle. So he gets into the office. At this point, we move ahead a few years, and we'll remember that Jim Guy Tucker ran into legal troubles and was eventually convicted of charges stemming from whitewater investments and this sort of thing from the investigations into the 70s and 80s and Clinton land deals and all this. He, after some drama, resigns his position, and Mike Huckabee in summer of '96 becomes governor of Arkansas. Huckabee, as lieutenant governor, was eyeing the U.S. Senate seat in his own right, and decided to stay in the role, and ended up being a very popular, as you mentioned, governor for a little over 10 years. If you factor in the Tucker term that he fulfilled and then two more 4-year terms. I think he was popular, and we look back now, and it was such a different partisan period. He tried very hard to build bipartisan relationships with the legislators in Little Rock at the time that were solidly Democratic. He was always, he is today, I think he would say, he's pretty frank in his public statements. He had a way about him that was sort of common sense and approachable and likable by a great many Arkansans. And he did a lot of outreach toward Democrats. He had to work with Democrats in a state that was overwhelmingly loaded with Democratic elected officials. So bipartisanship was a necessity for him. I think that was a big part of it. Plus, he's governor at a time when we're starting to see Republicans make some gains in the state. We can't just look at him. We look at Tim Hutchinson, who goes on to win the U.S. Senate seat that at one point Huckabee was eyeing. We look at a few House seats that since the 80s had swapped back and forth from Republican hands to Democratic hands and then back to Republican hands. So he wasn't the outlier that, say, a Winthrop Rockefeller was in the 1960s, but he was still very keenly aware that his party was in the minority, and in order to govern, he had to work with other people. Also, and I think it's fascinating to say, sometimes his harshest critics came from his own party. There were people within his party that felt he was not pushing a conservative agenda hard enough in his state. And so he would say things in the paper where he would call out certain Republicans and consider them extremists and say, I've got to be governor of the state. And in order to get a Republican governor, you're going to have a Republican that can work with Democrats. So it was a different era, different time. I think he did well in that era as governor, and as you mentioned, it was quite popular. Was reelected on his own right, and his approval ratings, which historically we've typically liked our governors. His approval ratings were always above water, as they say, and he was able to get a few things done that I think Republicans certainly before him struggled to work with the Democratic legislature, and I think Huckabee enjoyed more success than they did.
Right. Okay. Something that I inferred, or at least my interpretation from your book, was when the Democrat Party became more liberal, and that's sort of a vague or maybe cliche term, but liberal in the late 1960s and early 1970s, you bring up the fact that the state were still electing a lot of Democrats. Can you explain any difference, or at least the way I interpret it was, why the state was so slow, let's say, to maybe switch to voting for Republicans if the national Democrats were very liberal, even if the state Democrats were conservative? Maybe I've just answered the question, but still, I want to hear your interpretation.
Well, I think your interpretation is pretty solid. What I will say to sort of elaborate, though, is we had in the 1960s Winthrop Rockefeller, who came on the scene. He had really moved in the 1950s, was involved in the Faubus administration, was always sort of on the outside looking in of the Faubus machine, if you will, but was seen as a pro-business ally of Faubus, helped bring in jobs and manufacturing in the state, and of course built this beautiful farm on a mountain of all places at Petit Jean. So he was a Rockefeller, right? So there was a certain mystique about him, and he spent a considerable sum, his personal fortune, building, really funding a new type of Republican Party. That party, his version of it was certainly at the time rather progressive. When the Democratic brand, the Democratic Party in Arkansas, was more of a classic Southern conservative Democratic Party in we might say, the pre-civil rights era. We see a shift in the 60s and 70s nationally, as you said, where the Democratic Party becomes, particularly on social issues, we might say more liberal, and the Republican Party becomes more conservative. And as Rockefeller ascends to the governor for two, I would say, hard-fought 2-year terms, his party is moving out from under him. His party is moving more to a conservative base, consistently conservative base. And we have to remember the 1960s, even nationally, you had some Republicans that were more liberal than some of the more conservative Democrats in Congress, and vice versa. So we did not have the party sorting that we see today, and we started to see and particularly in the 80s and 90s. So the South becomes more Republican as the Republican Party becomes more conservative. Arkansas, I have a few ideas here. One is Arkansas had certainly by the 70s, a really uniquely gifted bench of political talent. And Diane Blair referred to them as the big three. So we had Bumpers, Pryor, and Clinton. And all three were personally probably more progressive than your average Arkansas voter, but they had a unique talent for connecting with their voters and connecting with folks back home. And Arkansans, for a long time, held a high premium for retail politics and personal connection. We're a small state. We were even a smaller state back then. And so you had elected officials who were able to walk a line between the National Party, what they saw out of D.C., and what was going on in Little Rock or what was going on around the state. And so you had governors and senators, all three of those gentlemen. Clinton, of course, becomes president, but you had all three of those gentlemen that had served at one point at the state level and then went on to D.C. and were able to communicate effectively back home in ways that allowed them to continue to make progressive strides, really, within the Democratic Party ranks nationally. The rest of the party was seen as out of touch and too liberal for most Arkansas voters. But I think those connections, and there were other elected officials that were very talented at this too on the Democratic side, they were able to build bridges and connections that withstood a lot of those pressures. I think one thing that we can overlook is while Winthrop Rockefeller is the first Republican governor since Reconstruction in Arkansas, he is a pretty progressive figure. And his ascendance does two things. One, it breaks the Faubus machine. And two, it allows Democrats after him some cover to be more progressive in their own right. And so if we look at who votes in Rockefeller in 66 and again in 68, we see that a lot of those voters went on to vote for the likes of a Bumpers, a Pryor, and a Clinton, and many others that were pushing a more middle left politics and Democratic Party brand in the state. And this stood for a long time. Over time, we see a more nationalized politics. We see party sorting where if you're conservative, you're identifying as a Republican more and more. If you're liberal, you're identifying more as a Democrat more and more. And eventually, the walls around Arkansas that seem to be withstanding these pressures in the early 2000s break. And they break in a really swift fashion.
Very good answer. I mean, something I wasn't testing you, but you know what I'm trying to say. I just can't think of the words. But thank you because you've explained something that I had questioned, and I'm sure the reader who's seeing the book, they might want to know. How much would you say ideology plays in the Republican politics today, in Arkansas today?
I think it's essential. I guess a couple things come to mind. One, I feel like we're watching conservatism be redefined. The Barry Goldwater, conscious of a conservative days, even the Ronald Reagan era of conservatism, and then moving it forward to, say, George W. Bush era of conservatism. I don't think we're there anymore. I think we're seeing a different sort of conservative brand and conservative definition. It's not good or bad, but I think it's different. So when I say that we see a Republican Party today that is more ideologically pure than the Democratic Party was certainly 30 years ago in this state when it was enjoying dominance, the Republican Party is based on largely an ideological value and an ideological purity. Today, Republicans, by and large, not everywhere, but in most places in the state, their concern is not a Democrat beating them in fall of an election year. They're worried about losing in spring in a Republican Party primary by someone who is able to articulate a more conservative vision or critique their time in office as not being conservative enough. Now, again, conservative is sort of a fluid thing. I think we're seeing it change, and so that's fascinating in its own right. But I do think ideology plays a big role in Republicanism today, and that was the one of the critiques for a very long time was the Democratic Party was sort of a no party system in Arkansas. The state was so democratically organized that there was really no organization. You know, everybody, if you want to run for office, you just ran with a D by your name, and then the rest of it was personality, regional interests, and this sort of thing that would land someone in office and keep them there. So this is a different politics today. I think a lot of times we can think that, well, the Republicans now are a lot like the Democrats in, say, the 90s or the 80s in Arkansas. And I think it's quite different. And I think because of that, the Republican Party is better positioned now than the Democratic Party was in the state of Arkansas in the last 50, 60 years. Mathematically, you might be able to say, oh, the Democrats look like the early 70s Republicans in the state legislature. But because of that ideological push, I think Republicans have a tighter stronghold on the state's party politics, at least right now. Now, things can change next year, but for the foreseeable future, I think ideologically speaking, the Republicans are very cohesive, and it's been to their advantage so far. It seems to be a message that resonates with a lot of Arkansas voters.
Along those same lines, I'm going to segue to something you kind of hinted at in your answer. Tell us the differences in how the state Democrat Party controls its party and the Republican Party, state Republican Party controls its party.
So I think there's a couple things there in the book. A friend and colleague of mine, and we co-authored a survey of state party organizations. We took a study from 1999, and this is back in 2013, 2014. We surveyed state party organization officials around the U.S. And I got lucky in that the Republican and Democratic parties in 1999 in Arkansas responded to the survey, and then they did again some 15 years later. And so there was an interesting compare and contrast that we were able to do. And I was able to feature a lot of that data in the book. And what we saw there, organizationally speaking, is that the Republican Party for a long time wasn't much of an organization. It really struggled to catch fire, to really get momentum. And in the book, I talk with Asa Hutchinson, who speaks of a lot of the legal barriers that the Republican Party struggled with, such as the way that we funded party primaries up until the mid 1990s. It really disadvantaged the out party. And so party organization was a real struggle for Republicans. But what we see over time is the Democrats were not terribly organizationally sound either, right? They were just good at winning elections and staying in office. And so I think of it sometimes as they had muscles that they hadn't exercised as far as a party, get out the vote, voter registration, brand. And so when Republicans around 2008, 2010 really began to form an organizational structure that looks different than what Democrats were doing at the time. It happens to be, and I think some of this is dumb luck, but it happens to be right as the Republican Party brand begins to really catch fire among Arkansas voters. And so in '08 and 9, the Republican Party is struggling. Financially, it's struggling in Arkansas. There's very little organizational structure. The committee hires Doyle Webb to be their party chairman. And Doyle Webb is the first salaried party chair in Arkansas history, as far as I know. The Democratic Party does not pay their chair. It's not a full-time job. I'm sure it is a full-time job, right? But
Yes, yeah.
the workload itself is structured differently in the Republican Party now. And I think Doyle Webb, working with county organizations and doing some of the hard work that had started in the '90s, but really didn't come to fruition until around the late 2000s. And it happens to be right when there's a lot of people in Arkansas that are wanting to run as Republicans, and they had a party structure in place to capture lightning in a bottle. And I think a lot of it has happenstance and luck and timing, but it wouldn't have happened without those organizational structures being worked on over time. The Democratic Party never was terribly well organized, as I said, and even today, now it's the out party. So it has its own challenges there. The Republican Party, despite being the dominant party, does not seem to rest on its laurels when it comes to party organization. And I think today it's still bearing fruit for them.
Okay. We've got about a minute and a half. I've got one more question I want to squeeze in here. With Trump in power today, how does the Republican Party, how does it stand in Arkansas?
So in Arkansas, right now, the Republican Party, as of today, is strongly aligned with President Trump and his message and his goals. And in fact, we've seen some Republican officials in the state have to sort of evolve to that position, but we've seen that over the last several years. And we've seen some Republican officials, especially those leaving office on occasion, butt heads with that idea and draw the ire of a lot of Republicans. And so I think right now we see a state in Arkansas that couldn't really be more supportive of President Trump. And what I mean is the Republican Party's cohesively surrounding those core goals of his and supporting him. Our governor, of course, worked in President Trump's administration, Governor Sanders. And we're also seeing, if we looked at voter returns between 16, 20, and 24, we see that a share of the voters in those election cycles supported President Trump. So in 16, 20, and 24, and it's tiny, but we see a slight bump each time, always over 60%. But nevertheless, more Arkansas voters supported him in 16, 20, and 24. Every time, more of Arkansas supported him. So they seem to be locked into his vision and his goals. And I think the party aligns that way. And that's part of that conservative ideological fluidity. I think we're seeing that in real time, and we're seeing it play out before our eyes today.
Professor Davis, I wish we had this. I enjoy this program, and I'm so glad you're on this show. It's unfortunate for the kind of book that you wrote. We don't have the time to be more thorough and ask more questions, so I'm going to have to stop with that. And I'll just ask you at this point, as we conclude, if the reader or the person who's watching this program wants to contact you, in what social media how can they find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I would mention the book was published by UA Press. So if you want to buy the book, you can go to the University of Arkansas Press website. And also I'd mention, feel free if you have any questions or comments or feedback, you can email me at jcd09@uark.edu. And I'd mention too, I conducted 20 interviews for the book, and all of them are archived at the Pryor Center. So you can go to the Pryor Center website, and under our projects page, you'll see a blue to red project. And 19 of the 20 interviews are video recorded as well. One with then Lieutenant Governor, now Attorney General Tim Griffin, was audio only. And they're also transcribed, so you can read along and listen in real time. So hopefully everybody will check those out. And of course, I hope everybody reads the book, and that you want to have a discussion. You can email me at any time.
All right. Well, thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in reading From Blue to Red, The Rise of the GOP in Arkansas, you can check it out from the library or purchase it wherever books are sold. Also, you can find more information at uapress.com or at our website, nlrlibrary.org. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you next time.